A story is igniting controversy over the arguments around transgender children. In Texas, a father has been blocked from stopping the gender transition of his son, James, 7, to a girl called Luna. The story's been ongoing for a while. And the gist of it is this. There's a man and a woman. They have twin kids, age 7. The mother believes James is gender dysphoric and wants to be Luna. The father believes this is not true, and the mother is projecting this essentially. So they've gone to court over it. And now the father has lost, and the 7-year-old will, my understanding, begin treatments en route to a full transition. The reason this is so controversial is because of something called desistance. And we're going to get through, I've got a couple subjects I want to go through and talk to you about the issue. Desistance, I believe I'm pronouncing it correctly, is when transgender individuals later determine they aren't actually trans. I'll read something from a 2018 article just to give you the gist of it. The phenomenon of transgender children growing out of their transgender identity by the time they're adolescents or adults is called desistance by gender researchers. For decades, follow-up studies of transgender kids have shown that a substantial majority, anywhere from 65 to 94%, eventually ceased to identify as transgender. It's because of these findings that many people believe it is wrong to transition children. The counter to this has been to put kids on puberty blockers, but there's also very damaging effects of holding off puberty. You could result in lower intelligence, less bone growth, joint malformation, things like that. I'm not a scientist or an expert, so I'm just giving you the general rundown of some of the arguments. And here's what I want to do. Let's start with this story, because many of you are probably shocked and outraged that this is happening. We'll read through this, but I do want to present some counterpoints, and I want to show the research and why I think it's actually, so some people are arguing that desistance is incorrect because it follows previous diagnostic guidelines, and they argue now that, you know, people who will eventually grow out of being transgender, there's going to be less people. It's complicated. So let me read the story, and then I will walk you through the point. I believe I have data showing that we have reason to believe desistance may actually be accurate. But let's read. From the Washington Examiner. A jury in Texas returned a verdict on Monday that will prevent a Texas dad from intervening in the gender transition of his 7-year-old son. Jeffrey Younger had petitioned a court in Texas to grant him sole custody of his twin sons, James and Jude, in part to avoid a plan to infuse James with female hormones. James, who would like to be called Luna, has been the center of controversy in the heated debate among his parents and others. Anne Georgilis, the mother of the two boys, has advocated for James to transition into Luna and has strongly backed the idea of chemically castrating her son and beginning hormone replacement therapy. Now, I want to stop and just stress Examiner is a more right-leaning source, and admittedly, nobody's covering this story. So I chose the best source. I tried to use something that wasn't overtly biased. While I think chemically castrated is a bit loaded, it is accurate that putting children on these treatments can result in permanent sterilization. So let's read on. The ruling on Wednesday will prevent Jeffrey from having sole custody of his children and paves the way for Georgilis to proceed with the procedure. The court has ruled that Georgilis will maintain sole custody of her two children and go forward with plans to give James life-altering medical procedures. Her original court filing had sought to limit her ex-husband's visit with their children and require that he now refer to James as Luna. She further asked that Jeffrey not be exposed to any people who would not confirm his female identity. Expert witnesses expressed doubt that James was fully convinced that he was inherently female in testimony last week. There is still some fluidity in his thinking, said Dr. Benjamin Albritton in sworn testimony. Neither child appears to be depressed, anxious, or aggressive. James gave no indications of other significant psychological difficulties. There are no laws currently preventing a legal guardian from giving a minor puberty blockers or hormones. Georgilis has additionally secured a letter of recommendation for transition for James from a woman associated with a gay children's therapy center. This is a letter of recommendation that my client, James Younger, aka Luna, begin the process of becoming a patient of the Genesis Clinic so that she can receive a full psychological assessment for gender dysphoria and potentially take hormone blockers, said a letter from Rebecca Uhr from Dallas Rainbow Therapy. So I'll make a few points before we actually get into the science. For one, it seems like the letter of recommendation isn't immediately saying they are going to make this child transition. The quote actually says they do a psychological assessment, in which case it may result that they don't move forward. I'm not going to, the details are going to be, few and far between. It's a very contentious political subject. I want to make one political point, a question I have for the transgender community and for this, individual's mother, and I ask this in good faith. We don't allow children to do many things. We don't allow them to imbibe alcohol. We don't allow them to smoke cigarettes, and we don't allow them to smoke marijuana in places where it's recreationally legal. We do this because we know there are effects that'll have on the body for long term, which can be negative. Is it okay if a parent determines that their child can drink alcohol? The reality is, no, you can't. If you are a parent, you cannot give alcohol to your kids. Now I know, I'll stop here. It's not a one-for-one analogy. Hormone therapy for a mental, I don't know what you want to call it, for a disorder, dysphoria, is completely different from recreational drugs. I understand. The point I'm trying to bring up is not that they're the same, but at what point do we allow parents to override legal precedent? And at what point do we allow children to decide they should do something? The better question would be, in my opinion, child marriage. If a child says they want to marry an adult, can the parent tell the government, yes, I condone this? In many instances, I believe the answer is actually yes. And in some places, the answer is no. The reason I bring this up is because most people in this country would reject the notion of child marriage outright, whether it's legal or not. They will say, no way, I'm not going to let my kid do this. But here's the thing. Marriage is not a permanent alteration to the individual's body. In which case, what about a child choosing who they love and want to marry is different from a child going on hormone blockers, which will have long-standing and permanent effects. I ask this in good faith. I am not saying it's a perfect analogy, and there may be a simple answer. It's a question that I've heard time and time again, and I think anybody who wants to, in good faith, engage with the conversation we're going to be having, please just comment with a legitimate response. It is not a gotcha question. I am seriously curious what your answer will be. For those that are very concerned about this, I want to mention the stories go both ways. A few years ago, in the UK, a 7-year-old was put into the father's custody after mother raised him as female. This story is from 2016, and it is an inversion. This is in the UK. They say that the mother had caused, High Court Judge Mr. Justice Hayden ordered for the child to be moved into his father's care because his mother had caused her son a great deal of emotional harm. You're seeing this story now. There's a lot of outrage, but there's an inverted version of the story which got much less attention several years ago. I bring this up just to say, a lot of people are acting right now like this is the apocalypse. They're saying this precedent is being set. We can't allow this. Hold on. First and foremost, these are different countries. I understand that. Secondly, we don't know all of the details of what the jury decided and why. We can make a lot of assumptions. It's probably not a good idea. In the end, I understand the political arguments. I understand the ramifications of the story, and I will respect people's opinion, to a certain degree. So have them. Let's get into the real issue here. There's something called desistance, and they say that 65 to 94% of children who identify as transgender eventually grow out of it. The argument then being that if they're much more likely, 94% is huge. If they're much more likely to grow out of it, and we have seen cases where, trans children have eventually determined they were incorrect. There was a 60 Minutes Australia documentary on it. Blair White has talked about it. If it's much more likely they will not be trans growing up, perhaps we should not put, we present a greater risk by putting them on hormone blockers or by transitioning them as children. One of the arguments has then been just do blockers because once the child desists in adolescence, you can then take them off puberty blockers. And that is sort of a compromise coming from the trans rights community, but it is still true that hormone blockers, puberty blockers, will have long-standing permanent effects on cognition and vision and joints and things like that, at least according to what I've read. Now, here's the actual counter-argument from the researchers. This is kqed.org. They actually say that one of the criticisms is that the numbers of the percentages for what they've rated for desistance are actually incorrect. So here's what they say. One reason many researchers believe it's unnecessary to delay the social transition of a child is that they don't think the research on desistance is valid. In other words, they think the number of children who grow out of their transgender identity has been vastly overblown. So in this circumstance, they're talking about a social transition, meaning you can take a 7-year-old child, you can change their name, you can give them different clothes, and they can be, female presenting in their social life without doing anything else. And so they argue that won't have permanent, long-lasting effects on the child. I would argue, however, it would have a very interesting and long-lasting psychological effect because, when you're 7, you're absorbing a lot of information. And arguably, there's a pro to a social transition. You might have an understanding of how society treats little girls as you grow up and grow older, but there will be permanent mental effects. Now, they say that the number of children who grow out of it has been vastly overblown, and this is what they argue. They say this school of thought holds that because the criteria for a diagnosis of gender dysphoria, previously called gender identity disorder, was less stringent in the past, the earlier desistance studies included a large cohort of children who today would not be diagnosed with gender dysphoria. Gay boys who may have been experimenting with different ways of expressing gender, but who were never really transgender in the first place. They said, quote, "The methodology of those studies is very flawed because they didn't study gender identity," said Diane Ehrensaft, Director of Mental Health at UCSF, Child and Adolescent Gender Clinic. Those desisters were, a good majority of them, simply proto-gay boys whose parents were upset that they were boys wearing dresses. They were brought to the clinics because they weren't fitting gender norms. Now here's where I'm going to stop and push back on this. Not a researcher, there's probably a lot of things I don't know, and that's fair. But I have to ask this question, and I have to present a counterpoint. If it's true, they have made the criteria for gender dysphoria much more stringent than gender identity disorder. And they're arguing now that back then, children who were not trans were being diagnosed as trans. It should follow, to a certain degree, we would see less transgender children, correct? Gender dysphoria has more rules, more determinant factors as to what makes a child trans versus identity disorder. Notably, there's 8 for gender dysphoria, but only 5 for gender identity disorder. If it is harder to get diagnosed as gender dysphoric, wouldn't we see less kids being diagnosed? In fact, the data shows us otherwise. From the Houston Chronicle, according to the Williams Institute at UCLA, which studies orientation and identity law and public policy, the percentage of trans adults, an umbrella term used to describe those whose gender does not match with their gender assigned at birth, has doubled in the last 10 years from 0.3 to 0.6%. In a 2006 survey, a survey discovered that 1.2% of Boston high school students identified as trans. And in a recent issue of the journal Pediatrics, researchers showed that 2.7% of Minnesota's youth identify as trans and gender nonconforming. Similar to trans, gender nonconforming describes those who reject gender expectations that assume only females can do femininity while only males can do masculinity. I think it's important for the conversation we're having to differentiate between gender dysphoria and gender nonconformity. Here's the issue. To be gender dysphoric, you have to have a strong dislike of one's anatomy. So if anyone can be a woman, so this is one of the big challenges I see with the trans rights argument, trans rights side. They argue that a woman can have male parts. Okay, but gender dysphoria requires that you have a strong dislike and a strong desire for the physical, sexual characteristics that match one's expected gender. Meaning, to be diagnosed as dysphoric, you have to be binary. Non-binary is something totally different. Take a look at this story. She-Ra and the Princess of Power introduces non-binary character Double Trouble, voiced by non-binary star Jacob Tobia. I actually think the story's fine and cool, but it does raise some questions. This is Jacob Tobia, who is a non-binary individual. You can see they do things that are traditionally considered feminine. And the character in She-Ra is non-binary. I think it actually makes sense. You have an androgynous character that can shapeshift. It's very, very much like an anime called Full Metal Alchemist. If you're not familiar, a homunculus is an artificial human, and one of the characters in Full Metal Alchemist, whose name is Envy, is completely androgynous, without gender, and has the ability to shapeshift. And that's kind of a point made in that show, and this is very similar. In this show, they've hired a non-binary identified actor to play the role of their shapeshifter character. Here's the thing, though. Non-binary and trans are very, very different. In this circumstance, Jacob Tobia, whatever his orientation is different from his identity. We can see that for the most part, non-binary just simply means he does traditionally feminine things. But if the argument is that, gender is a social construct, gender dysphoria has guidelines which say it's not, it's actually biological. We need to separate those things if we're going to have a real conversation. Because this is not transgender. This is somebody who wants to appropriate female social behaviors And I quite literally think that's fine. I mean, you dress us exactly how you want. The way I normally put it is, I don't care what you're wearing or how you're living. Just, up until the point you start, attacking other people or throwing things at other people. If Jacob sees himself this way and he wants to dress this way, more power to him. I believe it's actually a cool thing that in our country, you can just dress and exist how you want to, for the most part. But addressing non-binary now brings me back to the core issue here. Gender dysphoria's criteria actually talks about anatomy. So we addressed that as we have, but let's go back to the main point, and we'll come back to this in a second. If people who identify as trans have doubled over the past 10 years, and I understand it says adults, so it's very different from children, how is it that these adults who are transitioning as, who are older and transitioning weren't more likely to be classified as with gender identity disorder when it was much easier to be classified as such? Why are the number of children identifying as trans growing if the criteria has become more difficult? In which case, I would say it is likely that we are going to see much, much more desistance. If the argument is such that in the past, there were too many people falsely diagnosed, I think it's fair to say today, if the numbers are ever increasing but the rules are harder, we're seeing a greater proportion relative to those who transition who will likely desist. And if that's the case, wouldn't we err on the side of do nothing to the children until they're at least entering the stages of puberty, 13 or 14? Don't ask me. I don't set policy. I have argued against some of the holes in laws, or I should say not necessarily argued against, but presented the holes in a lot of these laws, such as an adult male competing against females. They clearly do have an advantage. It's interesting. It's interesting that when you talk about transgender individuals in sports, they always defer to the individual, but when it comes to other issues, they'll defer to the more broad spectrum. Let me give you an example. I had a conversation with Sam Cedar on this channel a few days ago. He said voter ID was racist because when you look at who will be affected by it, overwhelmingly, it'll be the black community. My argument was about the individual. I said, why do they act like people it's more likely to affect black people when there are more white people? And he argued for the collective instead of the individual. I found that interesting. In this regard, when it comes to sports, they don't argue for the collective. They argue for the individual. They say individuals vary and the best of the best win. The point I'm trying to make, I've made in the past, is that if you have 100 men and 100 women, the high end of the bell curve for talent for men will surpass that of women, meaning the most physically capable woman in terms of, let's use running, will be slower than like the top 20% of fastest men. So the world's fastest man is typically, they're going to be faster than the world's fastest women for basic reasons like they're taller and have longer legs. But it also means that men who would never qualify for the top bracket for the Olympics will be more likely to be better than the best woman. And I'm not saying all men. I'm saying there will be a tiny, tiny, tiny percentage of men who are not good enough to be the best, but are still better than the best females. In which case, you will have a decent, disproportionate amount of people who transition who are more likely to have surpassed some of the better women. In which case, I don't know what the solution is other than a transgender bracket specifically for trans women. I don't really see a problem with that. Then you're dealing with a more fair and balanced approach. And we've created women's sports specifically so that biological females have a space to compete against each other. Wouldn't it then make sense to have a trans woman bracket and a trans man bracket? I think that would, make a lot of sense. So anyway, I bring all these things up simply because they're questions I have, and they play into the role of the Texas father who's being stopped from, the court has ruled against him. My question to everybody, in complete good faith, and I hope it gets taken that way, but it probably won't, is to reiterate, if the criteria for dysphoria is much more stringent, then why are we seeing substantially more children identify as trans? You can't simultaneously argue that there was an overdiagnosis in the past, so we made the rules harder, and that's why desistance is wrong, but at the same time, with the rules being harder, we're seeing way more trans kids. This plays into the idea of something called rapid onset gender dysphoria, where they believe social pressures are convincing parents and children that they're likely trans when they're not, and then they're seeking out treatment and, they get diagnosed. It may also be true that because in the past, parents likely would not bring their kids. They would say, no, you're my kid. I don't accept this. It is socially unacceptable. You will not go to the doctor. that's another reason why we're seeing more kids. It is more socially acceptable. Therefore, more parents are willing to bring their kids in to be diagnosed. You tell me what you think. Present to me your questions. I do all of this in good faith because it is a very sensitive issue that gets everybody angry. YouTube will delete my channel and all these other things just for talking about this stuff. So I ask everybody to have a calm and rational conversation. Talk about what you think. Am I wrong? Let me know. Next segment will be coming up at 4 p.m. at youtube.com/Timcast. It's a different channel, and I will see you all there.